Yeah, yeah. Thank you, Dr. Sumit. Thank you for this. And so now we start with the session. Respected judges and dear participants, a very warm welcome to BOA MOS Focus 21 program. This is a Kansky Hall and free paper session 7. Time duration is 2:15 to 3:30 p.m. But we are a little bit delayed, so nothing to worry with that. We're going to overcome this. I am Dr. Nilesh Jain, practicing ophthalmologist and head of the department in Family Multi-Speciality Hospital named BJ Hospital, Gondia. I am moderator for today's session. Hello, everyone. This is time. We have got an overwhelming response from all over India regarding the free paper submission. All thanks to Dr. Ragini ma'am, Dr. Parikshit sir, Dr. Pritham, Dr. Siris Thora sir, Dr. Swapna Saumant sir, and Dr. Sumit Lahani. Now, I introduce our judges briefly. Dr. Sarvadi sir.
Thank you, Dr.
Welcome,
Nilesh
sir.
bhai.
Yeah, thank you, Ragini ma'am. Dr. Sarvadi sir, he is the head of the department in ophthalmology, Solapur Medical College. Besides being prolific ophthalmologist, he is an artist at heart, and his paintings are difficult to differentiate from real life photographs. Welcome, sir, for this session. Hello.
सरवदे सर आवाज नहीं आता. You are not audible, sir.
Okay. Shall I continue?
Yes, sir. Continue. Please.
Yeah. So another judge is Dr. Sahas Budhe sir. He's a professor and head of the department at Nanded Government Medical College, and he's a very senior teacher and known for his student-friendly nature. Besides teaching of them, he is also a fantastic yoga teacher. Welcome, sir. Dr. Kalnar, Mrs. Sashi Prabha Prasad, head of the department of ophthalmology, Dr. D.Y. Patil Medical College, Pune. She is a very student-friendly and very disciplined academician who has raised the bar of ophthalmology residency in medical college. Welcome, ma'am, for this session.
Thank you so much. Thanks
Yes,
a lot.
Thank you,
Thanks
sir.
a lot.
Dear judges, you already got a mark list for this free paper session. Please fill marks and send back after this session.
Yes.
Now, coming to the participants, so there are total 9 participants are there, and the sequence for the presentation will be, the first sequence will be the Dr. Nidhi Patel, then second one is Dr. Varsha Puranik, third one is Kamala Balakrishna, fourth is Faikia, then Dr. Deepak Sarkar, Dr. Akshita Sharma, Dr. Pranjali Sirshagar, Dr. Diksha Thorat, and Dr. Shalaka Sirshagar. So, few points I should mention regarding our participants is you have a 6 minutes time each for presentation. Out of this, 5 minutes is for presentation and 1 minute is for discussion. If not finished in given time, marks will get deducted. And please mute your mic during session for the proper running of the session. Over to judges.
Yes.
You would like to comment something, ma'am, or sir?
Thank you
Shall
so
we
much
start? Yeah.
for having me here as judge. And I know all the speakers will be deliberating within time. They will not. They will be up to time only. And I wish all of them all the best. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Okay. Yeah. So we'll start with the first presentation of this session. A case report of superior variant of pellucidal marginal degeneration by Dr. Nidhi Patel. Over to Dr. Nidhi, please.
Yes. Am I audible?
Yes, you are audible, please.
Little louder. Just talk little loudly. Be near to your
yes.
screen. Yeah.
Yes. Good afternoon, everyone. Today I'm presenting a case report of superior variant of pellucid marginal degeneration. Objective: to study a case of atypical variant of pellucid marginal degeneration. Introduction. Pellucid marginal degeneration. Pellucid marginal degeneration is a bilateral peripheral corneal ectatic disorder which is characterized by band of thinning 1 to 2 mm in width, typically in a inferior cornea, extending from 4 to 8 o'clock position. The area of thinning is usually found 1 to 2 mm central to the inferior limbus. The atypical cases are thinning extending beyond the inferior 4 o'clock and thinning confined to superior location. And the third one is a unilateral presentation. Case. 33-year-old male patient came to the tertiary eye care center with the chief complaint of diminution of vision in both the eyes since past 6 months. Patient has a no significant history of trauma, eye surgery, eye drops, or prescription glasses. Visual acuity of right eye was counting finger 2.5 meter, which is improved to 6/80 with the correction of -10 cylinder at 80 degrees. And visual acuity of the left eye was counting finger 2.5 meter, which is improved to 6/24, which is with correction of -6 diopter at 50 degree. Slit lamp examination shows superior corneal stiffening. Dilated fundus examination shows a normal fundus in both the eyes. Corneal topography was done, which is shown in the next slide. Left eye C3R procedure was performed within 15 days, and right eye cataract surgery was done a year later with toric lens. This is a slit lamp examination showing the superior corneal thinning. This is a topographic picture of the right eye, which shows the tangential map of the topographic image shows the crepuscular appearance on a superior part of the cornea. And the anterior and the posterior elevation map shows a warm color on the superior part, which is suggestive of corneal ectatic disorder specific to the superior part, which is suggestive of superior pellucid marginal degeneration. And the same topographic picture of the left eye, which is also shown the same superior warm color, suggestive of superior part of the ectatic disorder. Discussion. As seen, maximal corneal protrusion typically occurs just superior to rather than within the area of thinning. This result is a corneal contour, which is remnants of the beer belly appearance. The protruding cornea is a normal thickness. Shape produced as a typical crab claw appearance. Computer-assisted topography may reveal corneal contour abnormalities in an asymptomatic family member of pellucid marginal degeneration patient, even when the slit lamp examination is normal. The findings typical of keratoconus, specifically protrusion within the area of corneal thinnings, Vogt striae, and flesh ring are not seen in the PMD. Spectacles are usually failed to adequately correct the high regular astigmatism associated with the typical cases of PMD. Differential diagnosis. Keratoconus, as we discussed earlier, the typical finding that is protrusion within the area of corneal thinning, Vogt striae, flesh ring are not seen in PMD. Tirian's marginal degeneration has a male predilection with the vascularization, lipid deposition. When corneal protrusion occurs in a Tirian's degeneration, it is usually within the area of thinning, and it can affect both the superior and inferior part of cornea. Murray's ulcer is a unilateral condition which is associated with the inflammation, epithelial defect, ulcer with undermined central edges with the vascularization up to the peripheral edge. Corneal changes in Murray ulcer are not confined to inferior or superior cornea. And the last one is the idiopathic furrow degeneration, which is also bilateral, non-inflammatory, but within a corneal arcus. So the conclusion is that the pellucid marginal degeneration can occur superiorly also and should be considered in differential diagnosis of superior corneal ectatic disorders. These are my reference. Thank you.
Very nice presentation, Dr. Nidhi.
Thank you,
Over
sir.
to judges. Yeah, judges, please. You want to have some comments?
What is the prognosis in this case, and how will you follow up this case?
We can follow up this case with the sequential topographic profile of this patient, and with the slit lamp examination and topographic finding, we can identify the progression of the disease.
Then how will you manage if it progresses?
Mostly the spectacles are not are mainly fail in this high regular astigmatic changes, so we can go for the rigid gas permeable contact lenses, otherwise scleral contact lenses, or if it is, then it is not suitable for the patient or it fail and the progression is there, we can also go for the penetrating keratoplasty also. And
any role of C3R?
Yeah, C3R, there is a role of C3R in this case.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, ma'am.
Anyone else? Dr. Judges, sir? Sir Subudhu, sir?
Was she prescribed glasses? What power of the glasses was prescribed? Because in the paper you mentioned -10 in one eye and -6 in the other eye. The difference is more than 4. Am I not audible?
Sorry, sir.
Am I not audible?
Yeah, yes,
Yes,
you are audible.
sir.
You are audible.
Yes,
You are
yes.
audible.
Right,
Yes, yes.
right. My question was regarding power of the glasses you prescribed.
So with a cylinder, we also go for the other eye cataract surgery with the toric lens. So with the cylinder correction of the
Okay, it's all right.
Okay. So, Dr. Sarvadi, sir, you want to ask something?
No, it's all right, sir.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Nidhi.
Yes,
Now
sir.
our next participant is Dr. Varsha Puranik. She's also ready with the presentation, and her topic is: can the post-operative follow-up visit be deferred up to 4 weeks after an uneventful cataract surgery? It's a randomized controlled trial. Over to Dr. Varsha.
Good afternoon, everybody. Myself, Dr. Varsha Puranik, and I'm presenting the paper on can the postoperative follow-up visit be deferred up to 4 weeks after an uneventful cataract surgery. Globally, the cataract is the single most common cause of the preventable blindness, accounting for around 51% of the total cases. So the normal post-op follow-up regimen that we follow as per the NPCB guideline is the first visit is mandatory, which is carried out at day 0. The second visit is carried out at day 7, and the third visit being carried out at day 30. But as per the modern cataract surgical techniques are evolving, there is decrease in surgical complication, but as per there is increasing life expectancy, there is increasing demand for the cost-effective high-volume cataract surgery. So the aim of my study is, can the post-operative follow-up visit be deferred up to 4 weeks after an uneventful cataract surgery? The objective is to compare the post-operative visual outcome in a patient with two follow-up, that is in two groups, that is one between carried out at day 0, day 7, and day 30, while the other group being followed up at day 0 and day 30. To assess the safety of deferral of the second follow-up visit after an uneventful cataract surgery, and to analyze the cost of follow-up visits for both the provider and the recipient of the follow-up visit. The inclusion criteria were all the patients between the age group of 40 to 80 years with age-related immature uncomplicated cataract willing to undergo the cataract surgery, the patient in whom we expected the post-operative best corrected visual acuity to be 660 or more than that, then the absence of any ocular or systemic comorbidity, and patient who were having any intraoperative or immediate post-op complication were excluded from the study. In a methodology, this was a randomized controlled trial, so the patient operated by phacoemulsification and SICS were randomly allocated into the 4 groups actually. The group 1 and group 3 were the patient with the follow-up visits on day 0, day 7, and day 30, while the group 2 and group 4 were the patient with the follow-up visits on day 0 and day 30. Statistical analysis was carried out with the EP-info technique, and the sample size comes out to be 848. Chi-square test and ANOVA test were the other tests that were employed. So we divided the 848 patients equally among the 4 groups. Coming to the results, distribution of the age of the patient in the 4 groups were comparable. Similarly, results were found for the gender also, and chi-square test showed that there was no significant association between the gender and patients of the 4 groups. This graph is showing perioperative best corrected distance visual acuity, and the value was not statistically significant. Similarly, the uncorrected distance visual acuity at day 0 showed the no statistically significant value. This was the result of uncorrected distance visual acuity at day 30 and best corrected distance visual acuity at day 30. And in both groups, the mean UCDVA as well as BCDVA of group 1 was comparable with the group 2, and group 3 was comparable with the group 4. This graph is showing the slit lamp examination at day 30, and these were the abnormalities found in the 4 groups, the opacified posterior capsule being the most common abnormality. This table is showing the cost analysis for the patient, and we included spectacle cost, medicine cost, travel, and the food cost. And for all these, the p-value comes out to be statistically significant, that is less than 0.05. Similar results were also found for the provider. This table is showing the comparative analysis for the visual outcome and the cost analysis. So for the visual outcome in all the 4 groups, the value was not statistically significant, but for the cost in the group 1 and group 3 that was followed up at day 0, 7, and 30, there was definitely the higher amount of the cost than the group that were followed up at day 30. So the conclusion of my study is postoperative visual outcome after an uneventful cataract surgery in a patient living at 4 weeks after cataract surgery to those that is directly followed up at 30 weeks is comparable. Significant amount of resources can be conserved both by the patient and the provider after deferring the follow-up visit at the day 7. And definitely phacoemulsification is a surgery of choice considering the postoperative visual outcome. However, in our study, we have excluded the eyes with the ocular pathology. Also, all the surgeries were performed by the experienced surgeon only. Hence, these results are not applicable for the postoperative management of the patient operated by the surgeon under the training. So the take-home message is, after an uneventful cataract surgery with no any systemic or ocular comorbidities and with no any intra or postoperative immediate complication, the second postoperative follow-up visit that is being carried out at day 7 can be safely deferred, but the patient so discharged must be counseled in detail about all the warning signs and symptoms that can be encountered during the postoperative recovery period. The phacoemulsification is the surgery of choice considering the postoperative visual outcome, but SICS is a cost-effective surgery in a developing country having high demands of high-volume cataract surgery with a limited resources. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Varsha.
Yes.
Over to judges, please.
Thank you, Puranik Madam, for the innovative presentation.
Thank you.
Stop sharing the screen,
but-
Dr. Varsha.
Sorry,
but
sir.
what
Please stop sharing the screen.
Okay.
Okay. Sorry, sir. Go ahead.
All right. But what I think is that what conclusions you draw or what thing you advocate will be applicable only to the elite group who are well educated in our
Mhm.
country, which is just developing and where the socio-economic strata of the patients is low. They can't know about the possible complications in the early period, which can be delayed if they come at the 4th week. So I think maybe it is actually, in fact, we all know that uncomplicated surgery, we just do follow-up. There is no active intervention. But still, I
Yes.
think that this has some limited application in practice.
Sir, our inclusion criteria, if the patients are meeting our inclusion criteria, that is a purely uncomplicated cataract with no
Right.
any intra-op and post-op complication, the second follow-up visit we can safely defer, sir.
The take-home message that this you operate at the surgeon and forget the surgeon. That's how what the message is there.
So we have included both the surgeon's factor also and the institutional as well as the patient's factor also. So our deferring the second follow-up visit, we have good results as per the cost analysis is concerned.
Right.
Thank you, ma'am.
Prasad ma'am. Prasad ma'am.
Same, no problem. I think I
Okay.
quite agree with her.
Okay.
Thank you.
Right. Okay.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Dr. Varsha.
Yes, sir, thank you.
So yeah, the next presentation is by Dr. Kamala Balakrishnan, and her presentation is an interesting case of Lawrence Moon Bardet Biddle syndrome. Over to Dr. Kamala Balakrishnan.
Sir, am I audible, sir?
Yes, you are audible. Please start.
Yes, sir. Good afternoon, respected dignitaries present for the symposium. My topic for today is an interesting case of Lawrence Moon Bardet Biddle syndrome. Myself, Dr. Kamala Balakrishnan, and my co-author is my HOD, Professor Dr. K. Eril Vendel, sir. So Lawrence Moon Bardet Biddle syndrome is a rare autosomal recessive genetic disorder which is also marked in the National Organization of the Rare Diseases, and it is usually commonly seen among consanguineous marriages. This disease was first described by Lawrence Moon in the year 1886, and later cases were added by Bardet and Biddle in the year 1920 to 1922. Due to its clinical similarity, now it is regarded as a single unit of clinical entity. Coming to the incidence, since consanguineous weddings are quite rare among North America and Europe, there the incidence rate is just 1:1 in every 150,000 live births, whereas the highest remains among Kuwait and Newfoundland, where it is about 1 in every 14,000 live births. Coming to the etiology, the Lawrence-Moon-Beadle syndrome is affected at the PNPLA6 mutation, and the Bardet-Biedl syndrome is affected by BBS1 to BBS12 gene. Coming to the case report, 18-year-old patient was brought to the OPD with complaints of night blindness since 2 years. He also had weakness of upper and lower limbs since 1 week, and he also found it difficult to mix his food to the mouth, marking severe ataxia and discoordination. He had no other significant past history, but history revealed that he had central obesity, well-marked central career for the recessive disorders, and they had consanguineous wedding, and the child has attained the autosomal recessive disorder. So coming to the detailed case report, on GPE, on the general physical examination, blood pressure and pulse rate was appeared to be normal. Central obesity, BMI of 31 according to WHO class 1 obesity was there. He also had speech abnormality and developmental delay since birth. His mental retardation IQ quotient was 50. Polydactyly of lower and upper limb was there, and hypogonadism, he had attained only Tanner staging 2, whereas he should have attained Tanner staging 4. Upper and lower limb weakness was there, and plantar reflex was flexor. Other systemic examination, cardiovascular, respiratory, and para-abdominal was found to be normal, and central nervous system, he had moderate mental retardation. This is a picture of his polydactyly on the right foot. There is hexadactyly. And his dorsal aspect of hand does not show the hexadactyly, but on the lateral aspect, we can see a nubbing beside his left hand. Coming to detailed ophthalmoscopic examination, visual acuity of right eye was 624 with pinhole 618, and left eye 636 with pinhole 618. Anterior segment evaluation was otherwise normal, except for conjunctival bited spot with the temporal bulbar conjunctiva, picture of which is attached. Otherwise, cornea, anterior chamber, pupil, and lens were within normal limits. Fundus examination revealed both eye disc tail with arterial attenuation, and whitish raised lesion was present all over the fundus, more around the macula, and foveal reflex was dull. Here's the picture. As we can see, the disc appears to be pale, and there is whitish, typical whitish raised lesions around the macula and throughout the fundus, and there is loss of normal fundal glow. So this is the OCT picture showing rod cone dystrophy of the patient. We had also done other tests in order to confirm other features of Lawrence-Moon-Beadle. His liver function, hemogram, renal function test, MRI brain, USG abdomen, echo, and ECG was also found to be normal. No other abnormalities were found. Coming to the management, Lawrence-Moon-Bardet-Biedl syndrome requires a multidisciplinary symptomatic treatment. As there is no permanent cure, whatever the patient has symptoms, we have to cure accordingly. Here, since the patient had bited spot, we had supplemented with vitamin A capsule, 2 lakh international units, and his glasses for his defective vision was also provided. Other than this, we had referred him to the physiotherapist for strengthening his muscles, psychiatric counseling for behavioral therapy, and nutrition for his nutritional well-balanced diet for his obesity. Lawrence-Moon-Bardet-Biedl syndrome is a rare autosomal genetic disorder, and the diagnostic criteria was according to the Beals et al. Study, wherein 3 or 4 of the primary features and 2 of secondary features should be present. Primary features include obesity, mental retardation, retinal degeneration, hypogonadism, polydactyly, and renal abnormalities. Here, only 3 was required, but our patient had 5 of the primary features, and here are other secondary features. Coming to management, the treatment modalities for ophthalmologically, we can treat according to symptomatically, and other than that, low vision aids can be provided if his vision is severely deteriorating.
Minute
Other
left.
than that, sorry, ma'am.
1 minute left. Continue.
Okay. Physiotherapy, a regimen of nutrition should be provided, and low protein diet, testosterone supplementation, and polydactyly surgeries can be done. This is just few recent advances in the treatment modality, Luxturna, setmelanide drug, and even rapamycin. So I thereby conclude my presentation by saying that Lawrence-Moon-Beadle syndrome patients are very friendly children, and the society should not have a stigma or discriminatory attitude towards these innocent children. If referred and diagnosed at the earliest, then the life quality can be definitely improved. Here are my references. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Kamala Balakrishnan. It was a very nice presentation.
Thank you, sir.
And over to judges. By the time, Dr. Kamala, please stop your sharing your screen, please. Yes, over to judges, please.
Dr. Kamala,
Yes,
You have said that it is an interesting case. What was interesting about it?
Sir,
Can you hear me?
It was a very, yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Huh.
Hello,
So
sir.
according
Sir,
to
it
you,
is a
what
very
was?
rare finding.
Yes, yes.
Sir, it was a very rare finding, sir, and it was even marked in the National Organization of Rare Diseases, sir. So since it was quite rare disorder, it was interesting to work out the patient and the presence. And the patient, he didn't have any other renal related complaints, sir, which is very typical of Lawrence-Moon-Beadle syndrome, sir.
Okay.
Hello. Yeah.
Kamala, what do you think about
Yes,
this fundus findings?
Ma'am, it showed atypical retinitis pigmentosa findings, ma'am. Typical retinitis pigmentosa, bony spicules or waxy tailor disc was absent,
Atypical
ma'am.
means
Other
central,
than that,
central RP, no?
yes, ma'am. The patient had whitish raised lesions over the macular region, ma'am.
Any other
Usually
DD
RP
for
lesions.
this? Any other DD for this? These type of changes in retina and the central near macula?
Yes, ma'am. Ma'am, macular dystrophies. And if it is near the macula, then even puncta albicans can be doubted, ma'am. It is more of whitish yellowish lesions.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, judges. Now, our next participant is Dr. Faikia, and she is going to present awareness of computer vision syndrome among the engineering fraternity. Over to Dr. Faikia, please.
Good afternoon, sir. Am I audible?
Yes, you are audible. Please carry on.
My slides visible, sir?
Yes, yes, yes.
Okay, sir. Thank you, sir. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm going to be presenting on awareness of computer vision syndrome among the engineering fraternity. Okay, so moving on to why this topic was chosen. In early times, man wanted the best distance vision for hunting. With the dawn of civilization, the need for near vision became as important as distance vision. Now, with the dawn of the technology era, our visual system strives for the perfect balance between distance, near, and intermediate vision. Ever since the computer became the center of the modern workplace, office workers are increasingly faced with the challenge of maintaining vision at intermediate distance for prolonged hours, which causes the visual system to remain in a state of constant fatigue. The American Optometry Association states that the people most at risk for computer vision syndrome or digital eye strain are those that use a computer or any digital device for that matter for more than 2 continuous hours per day. At this point, I would like to clarify 2 terms that are used interchangeably in literature, which is computer vision syndrome and digital eye strain. Computer vision syndrome is an umbrella diagnosis which consists of 3 things. One is the ocular manifestations. The second one is the circadian disturbances which occur due to prolonged computer usage. And the third one is musculoskeletal strain that accompanies prolonged computer usage. While the term digital eye strain is reserved mainly for 2 things, which is the first 2 things, and deals with the ocular surface compromise and the circadian disturbances which accompany computer usage. Now, even though people who use computers only for 2 or more hours a day are at risk, it is an occupational risk factor because the occupation plays a main role in determining the amount of strain on the visual apparatus. If the underlying mechanisms are understood and the processes that lead to discomfort and fatigue can be explained to the people, it is preventable to a large extent. Now, digital eye strain or computer vision syndrome is a multifactorial entity. Let's look at it one by one. So when we look at a difference between printed text and monitor display, when we're looking at a book, when we look at a printed text, it is a solid block of color. But when we look at an image displayed on a video display terminal, they are displayed as pixels, and these pixels are electronically generated font and they have very poorly defined edges. and therefore the contrast is low, and this adds to the visual strain. And in presence of poor ergonomics, glare, and poor lighting, this causes visual discomfort. In case there is an underlying uncorrected refractive error, asthenopic symptoms are felt by the patient more than a person who is emmetropic. The symptoms are eye strain, brow ache, headache, eye fatigue, and difficulty to focus on near or distant objects for a while after extensive work on the screen. Besides all of this, there is a main entity which involves the blink rate. Now, when we are at rest, the normal blink rate is about 16 blinks per minute. But when we, this can even increase up to 23 per minute when we are relaxed. But when we concentrate on something, this blink rate can even drop to 3.6 per minute. Now, this blink rate also drops when we are reading a book or using a computer. Why there's a difference is when we use a computer, our palpebral aperture is wider because the gaze angle is wider. We tend to look at it in the screen in front of us, while opposed to using a book, which is usually on the table. And so the palpebral aperture is less wide. When the palpebral aperture becomes wider, this leads to incomplete blinks as well. So a decreased blink rate coupled with an incomplete blink causes an alteration of tear dynamics because the distribution of tear fluid is incomplete. This leads, now when the blink is also incomplete, the meibomian gland secretion is also altered. So the lipid layer of the tear film is not complete. This causes an increased evaporation of the aqueous component of the tears. And so there are two components of dry eye disease here. We have a deficient secretion as well as an evaporative dry eye, which together causes an ocular surface compromise.
Yeah, I think you need to move little quickly because
yes, sir. Okay.
2 minutes
Okay,
left.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. So the objectives of my study were to find the awareness of computer-related health among 3 populations of engineers, to compare the screen time of professional engineers in IT and non-IT sectors, and to identify the lacunae in ocular health education. It was a descriptive study. The study population consisted of 3 distinct groups. One was engineering students, and the other group was professional engineers in the IT sector and professional engineers in the non-IT sector. Data collection was done with an online questionnaire having 14 questions, and the link was circulated through social media. Data analysis was done with SPSS software version 13. Coming to the results, we had a good distribution of students and people from the IT sector and non-IT sector. One of the most alarming things that we found was that 70% of the people had not undergone an eye checkup ever in their lives, and the other 30% of people who did undergo a regular eye checkup had already previous history of contact lens wear or an already diagnosed refractive error. Coming to this, when we compare the screen time of the IT sector and the non-IT sector, we can see that there's not much of a difference. The IT sector has logged a screen time of about 4.3 with a standard deviation of 3.2 hours, while the non-IT sector has logged 3.9 with a standard deviation of 3.1 hours per day. Now, a chi-square analysis was run. I will just draw your attention to a few important statistics here. A lot of people knew that prolonged computer usage can affect the eyes, but not a lot of people knew that it can affect other parts of the body other than the eye. Prolonged computer usage can cause sleep disturbances was known by a lot of people. And another thing I would like to draw your attention to is that blue light filter lenses prevent the harmful effects of prolonged computer usage. A lot of people thought that blue light filters would help with, so just 2 more minutes, would help with these symptoms. Now, just going to a question by question analysis, a lot of people thought that prolonged computer usage can cause sleep disturbances, but they do not understand the underlying mechanisms well. And a lot of people don't associate the chances of getting an eye infection with prolonged computer usage. They do not associate using computers to an actual organic eye disorder. Moving on to the discussion, we can see a comparable screen time between the IT and non-IT sectors. This can be chalked up to modernization of the workplace, digitalization, and widespread use of computer-aided technology. When we talk about blue light filters, the role of blue light filters are not really understood. Melatonin released by the pineal gland is dependent on light cues, and exposure of the melatonin-containing intrinsically photosensitive retinal ganglion cells to bright light at night can disturb the circadian cycle of hormone release. Now, these lenses typically block light in the blue light spectrum, which might prevent the suppression of melatonin released by the pineal gland. But it has been found that these lenses work mainly on the placebo effect, because the American Academy of Ophthalmology currently does not recommend any special eyewear for computer usage. And this speaks volumes to the proven efficacy of blue light filters in digital eye strain. This is a dictum 20-20-20 rule, which says that for every 20 minutes of computer usage, a person is recommended to take a 20-second break to look at something situated 20 feet away in order to relax the accommodation. The gaze angle is also stressed upon, where the posture of the person is given a lot of importance, and the gaze angle in which the screen is situated 40 to 75 centimeters away from the person, and the minimum gaze angle, that is from eye level to the center of the screen, should be at least 15 or 20 degrees in order to decrease the width of the palpebral fissure. Voluntary forceful blinking should be also stressed. Now, proper lighting also should be stressed upon. If a person is already wearing contact lenses, they should be counseled to switch to glasses because of contact lens induced dry eye and the ocular infections associated with contact lens usage. But none of this is a substitute for a proper refraction, binocular vision testing, and contrast sensitivity testing. These are the apps available for computer and mobile phone usage that remind you to take a break and relax your accommodation. My study does have limitations because though the questionnaire was
Dr.
sent to all
Paikia,
people.
please stop the presentation. Already we are 9 minutes over.
You
okay,
lost
sir,
your
just
time to
unfortunate.
answer the questions also. So we can't
Yeah.
do question answers for you.
And all other participants, please note this, we should be strict to the time.
You can stop your presentation with all due permission from the judges. Can we move to the next presentation, please?
Yes, we can.
Yeah.
Yes, yes.
Dipayan Sarkar,
Dr. Paikia, please stop sharing your screen.
Yes, sir.
Dr. Dipayan Sarkar, please share your screen.
The next presentation is by Dr. Dipayan Sarkar, and his presentation is age-related cataract prevalence and emerging risk factor across sectional study from Central India. Over to Dr.
So my
Dipayan.
screen is visible?
Yeah, screen visible and you're audible.
Respected judges, faculties, and my dear colleague, a very good afternoon to you all. The topic for my today's session is age-related cataract prevalence, emerging risk factors, a cross-sectional study from Central India. Cataract refers to loss of opacification of the crystalline lens. Cataract is the cause of 62.4% of blindness in a senile age group in India. Cataract remains the major contributor of curable blindness in adults aged 60 and above in 2020 and has an approximate burden of 15 million people worldwide. Age-related cataracts can be divided into 3 types: nuclear, cortical, and posterior subcapsular. Factors contributing to rise in the visual impairment due to cataract is increased life expectancy, shortage of adequate surgical facilities, inadequate case recognition, decision delivery, service delivery, increased demand for better vision. Pattern and distribution of cataract in different regions of the world are likely cause of variation in the geographic, genetic, and environmental factors. So an epidemiological study is required to better understand the prevalence, pattern, and epidemiological characteristics of cataract for effective strategy and better implementation of public health programs. There is considerable lacunae in knowledge about the epidemiological patterns of cataract from Central India. Aims and objectives of the study were to study the prevalence of cataract in the different age groups in Central India, to study the commonest types of cataract in Central India and correlate it with the demographic parameters, to study the association of tobacco smoking with cataractogenesis, if any, to study the association of socioeconomic status with cataractogenesis, if any. This is a hospital-based cross-sectional study. Study population was all the patients diagnosed of cataract. It was a single-center study done over a 2-year period from February 2019 to March 2021. Convenience sampling was done. As per this study mentioned, the minimum sample size for our study was calculated to be 399 subjects. We took 1033 subjects in our study. Inclusion criteria were all the patients who were diagnosed of cataract in our institute from in the 2-year study period. Exclusion criteria were medical records with incomplete data and all other causes of cataract having non-age related etiology. This is the data collection format. A total of 1854 patients records were accessed, of which 1128 patient records were found to be of cataract and 1033 patients records were finally selected, which were fulfilling the study criteria. Age was taken as per the ASP protocol of WHO, categorizing into 4 age groups. Residence was divided into rural and urban. A smoker was identified by the WHO smoking and tobacco use policy. Socioeconomic strata was assessed based on the BPL card holding status. Cataract grading was done by an ophthalmologist with full pupillary dilatation and the slit lamp examination using the Locke-3 classification. Statistical analysis was done using MS Excel and IBM SPSS software. P-value of less than 0.05 was considered significant. Of the subjects diagnosed with cataract, 60 to 79 years composed of the 48%, followed by the 40 to 59 years, which is the pre-senile age group, was composing of 41%. Male and female showed a similar prevalence of cataract in our study. Nuclear sclerosis was the highest form of cataract, consisting of 46%, followed by posterior subcapsular, 35%. Mature cataract was 20.1%. Among the mixed variants, NS plus PSC was the largest subtype, having 45%, and the lowest was the isolated cataract type, 12.8%. The subjects belonging to the rural population had 1.41 times higher odds of developing mature cataract compared to the urban population, and the association was found to be significant. Smokers were found to have 1.09 times higher odds of developing nuclear sclerosis and 1.24 times higher odds of developing mature cataract in comparison to non-smokers. Lower socioeconomic status was found to have 1.31 times higher odds of developing nuclear sclerosis, 1.27 times higher odds of developing cortical cataract, and 1.56 times higher odds of developing mature cataract compared to the higher socioeconomic strata. Discussion. Our study shows that an increasing prevalence of cataract is in the pre-senile age group. Chatterjee et al. In the study showed the age to be a major risk factor for cataract. Das et al. In the study hypothesized the cause of rise of pre-senile cataract is due to hypercholesteremia, tobacco use, sun exposure, smoke exposure, axial myopia, and hormonal factors. Study by Praveen Vashisht et al. Has shown the prevalence of PSC as an average of 21% in India, while in our study we found it to be 35%. The rise in the number of PSC cases in central India can be attributed to the increased sunlight received in this region. Association of UV and cataract has been shown in the study by Tandon et al. Tobacco smoking is a risk factor for cataractogenesis. The finding correlated with the study conducted by Krishna et al. The mechanism can be described as oxidative stress brought about by the reactive oxygen species generated by the smoke constituents. Subjects belonging to the lower socioeconomic strata were found to have higher prevalence of cataract. This finding concurs with the study conducted by Avachet SS et al. Conclusion: there is a rising prevalence of cataract among the pre-senile age group. This requires more focus of healthcare programs on controlling the risk factors and also to increase the capacity of cataract surgery to accommodate the burden of pre-senile cataract. The central India region has a higher prevalence of posterior subcapsular cataract. The general population needs to be educated in the use of UV protection glasses when outdoors. Health infrastructure in central India needs to be ramped up to reduce the cataract burden in this region. Health awareness and development of health infrastructure to reduce the prevalence of mature cataract is required in the rural population. Tobacco smoking was strongly associated with the higher prevalence of nuclear cataract. These findings suggest yet another need to educate the community on the importance of cessation of tobacco smoking and incorporation anti-smoking message into school health program. People belonging to the lower socioeconomic strata should be educated about the risk factors, and better health policies should be made to eliminate risk factors of cataract in this population. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Dr. Deepan. Please stop your screen sharing.
Yes.
Over to judges, please.
Dr. Deepayan.
Yes, sir.
In your paper, you have come to the conclusion that patients of higher socioeconomic status, they are having less cataract, isn't
Yes,
it?
sir. Yes, sir.
Yours is a government institute, and all of us from government institute, we know that the patients mainly coming to the government institute, they are from poor socioeconomic strata. So don't you think that this type of conclusion is probably erroneous from a government institute?
No, sir, because in my demographic study, I have found almost an equal distribution of socioeconomic strata. Like in my study, I had 64% in the higher socioeconomic strata, while the remaining 46% population was in the lower socioeconomic strata. So,
Attending,
sir,
attending your institute.
Yes, sir, at my institute. So as my institute is in the city, so sir, we get a lot of well-off patients also. It is we not only get, sir, only the from the rural population. We get, sir, all type of patients in our institutes. And sir, we are very happy to operate on the variety of the socioeconomic strata patients we are getting.
Okay.
Dr. Deepayan, my question to you is that you have labeled your paper as emerging risk factors. What
Yes,
is
sir.
the meaning of these emerging risk factors?
Sir, emerging risk factors is tobacco smoking. Tobacco smoking was not considered previously in the papers. Recent studies have now started giving up tobacco smoking as a risk factor. That I have proved, sir, in my study. And also, sir, I have found out that in central India, there is presence of, sir, the sunlight, huge amount of sun exposure, the UV radiations. They are causing a toll on the health of the population here. And it is causing a wide range of PS. Yes, sir.
Sunlight, etc. is all right, but how does the tobacco will induce cataract?
So tobacco induces cataract by formation of the reactive oxygen species. It is given that it is not generally because of it is hypothesized, it is not generally because of the nicotine, but the smoke products gets absorbed and the heavy metals like lead and cadmium gets deposited in the lens, and they lead to formation of reactive oxygen species, which cause damage to the lens matter, and this causes the lens hydration. And this causes... Yes, sir.
Have you found age difference in non-smokers and smokers, means early incidence in smokers?
No, sir, I haven't done that part of the study. I have just categorized them as smokers, but I have the data. I can proceed with that also.
Okay. Dr. Deepayan, I just have one question.
Yes,
why don't you include, you have included this tobacco, why don't you include alcohol? Because that is also a very emerging risk factor for all the people, even for the low socioeconomic and high socioeconomic extras.
Surely, sir, I would look into that aspect of including alcohol and doing a test.
One more question for Deepayan, sir. Deepayan, you said that this is an emerging risk factor, but if I remember correctly, almost 20-25 years ago, South India cataract study was done by Arvind Eye Hospital, and in that they have mentioned tobacco smoking as a risk factor.
Sir, they had hypothesized tobacco smoking as a risk factor, but there is no study that is done in central India that is showing tobacco specific to be a risk factor. And sir, the population size was also less. From the Arvind study that was done in, I think, sir, 2008 or 9, the population size was also less. Sir, as I have taken a large scale population, and also I have done a hospital-based study. So, sir, my study is different from what studies have been done before.
Okay. So, thank you, Dr. Deepayan. So, our next presentation is study of surgically induced astigmatism in straight and frown incision in manual SICS. It will be presented by Dr. Akshita Sharma. Over to Dr. Akshita, please.
Yes, sir. So, am I audible?
Yeah, you are audible and your screen is also there. No problem. Please carry on.
Good afternoon. The title of my paper is Study of Surgically Induced Astigmatism in Straight and Frown Incision in Manual Small Incision Cataract Surgery. Any opacity in the lens or its capsule, whether developmental or acquired, is called cataract. Cataract is the leading cause of blindness, 51%, and low vision, 33% worldwide. Surgical techniques for cataract extraction have undergone major advancement from intracapsular extraction to the present-day phacoemulsification. However, the most widely used surgical technique in third world countries still remains the sutureless manual small incision cataract surgery, or manual SICS. The incision is the most important step of the refractive procedures performed today. The concept of surgically induced astigmatism has added an entirely unique dimension to the cataract surgery, with an emphasis more focused on the refractive aspect of the surgery. Corneal or keratometric surgically induced astigmatism is defined as the vector difference between the preoperative corneal keratometric astigmatism and the postoperative astigmatism. Corneal astigmatism has been associated with cataract surgery since the first limbal incision was made. In order to provide a good postoperative vision, control of postoperative astigmatism is the key. The incision being the first and the most important determinant of the same, which can be modified in various ways in terms of size, shape, axis, etc., to reduce the degree of postoperative astigmatism. In this study, an attempt has been made to study the role of incision shape in reducing the surgically induced astigmatism. Herein, we compared the SIA between the two groups of patients who underwent frown and straight incision forms of manual SICS. The aim and objective of the study includes to determine the astigmatism in the postoperative patients of manual SICS with straight and frown incision, to determine and compare the surgically induced astigmatism in the two groups. We conducted a longitudinal study of 60 patients divided into a group of 30 each at the Department of Ophthalmology in a tertiary care hospital. The study was carried out over a period of 1 year. Patients belonging to 50 years of age and above of either sex and undergoing manual SICS were included. Patients having any corneal pathologies, congenital or developmental cataract, complicated cataract, posterior segment pathologies, and associated ocular pathologies like glaucoma, uveitis were excluded. The study was approved by the Institutional Ethics Committee and informed consent was taken from the participants. Data was collected using a structured performer. Preoperative visual acuity along with refraction was recorded using Snellen's chart. Cataract evaluation for grading and complete ophthalmic examination using slit lamp biomicroscopy and ophthalmoscopy was performed. Corneal curvatures, KH and KV were measured in diopters using an automated keratometer. The selected patients were further divided into two groups, Group A undergoing manual SICS with straight incision and Group B with frown incision. Patients were then followed up on post-operative day 1 at 3 weeks, at 6 weeks for post-operative keratometry and refraction. Surgically induced astigmatism was calculated using the SIA calculator version 2.1 and the data was analyzed using appropriate statistical tests. In the now the results in the table, we can see the age and sex-wise distribution of the patients in both the groups. The mean age in Group A was 62.53 plus minus 11.21 years, while in Group B it was 63.4 plus minus 11.16 years. Among the total population, 51.6% were males and 48.4% were females. Now then, the amount of surgically induced astigmatism was calculated in both the groups at each follow-up visit of post-operative day 1 at 3 weeks and at 6 weeks and tabulated as follows. The mean SIA in straight incision was 1.63 plus minus 1.10 at post-op day 1, 1.37 plus minus 0.69 diopter at post-operative 3 weeks, and 1.32 plus minus 0.60 diopters at 6 weeks. However, in the frown incision, it was 1.25 plus minus 1.03 at post-op day 1, 0.65 plus minus 0.32 at post-operative 3 weeks, 0.56 plus minus 0.26 at post-operative 6 weeks. The difference is statistically significant at post-operative 3 weeks and 6 weeks with p-value of less than 0.001. The progression of surgically induced astigmatism in both groups can be seen in the following diagram. Now the discussion, size, shape, and location of the external incision influenced the induced astigmatism after cataract surgery. Paul S. Koch formed a composite illustration called the incisional funnel consisting of an imaginary pair of curved lines diverging outward from the limbus. As the frown incision completely forms within the incisional funnel, that is how it becomes more stable. In our study, majority of the patients with straight incision, that is 30%, had SIA in the range of 1.25 to 1.5 diopter, followed by 26.6% in the range of 0.75 to 1 diopter. While in the frown incision, majority of the patients, 73.3%, had surgically induced astigmatism in the range of 0 to 0.5 diopters, followed by 23.3% in the range of 0.75 to 1 diopter. The findings suggested that of the surgically induced astigmatism being lower in the case of frown incision. Findings consistent with our study were found by Rajkumar Patra et al., where the patients with straight incision had astigmatism in the range of 1.1 to 1.5, and those with frown had less than 1 diopter astigmatism. Similar results were seen by study by Bumla et al., where the patients with straight incision had SIA in the range of 1.25 to 1.5, while frown patients had astigmatism in the range of 0.75 to 1 diopter. Johri et al. Had similar findings. As shown earlier in the table 3, the difference is statistically significant at post-operative 3 and 6 weeks. These results were consistent with studies performed by Bumla and Singer et al. However, Johari et al. In his study concluded there wasn't any significant difference in the post-operative surgically induced astigmatism in both groups. Finally, to conclude, in manual small incision cataract surgery, type of incision performed significantly changes the outcome in terms of surgically induced astigmatism. Frown incision achieves lower surgically induced astigmatism and offers a greater corneal topographic stability as compared to the straight incision. These are my references. Thank you.
Okay. Yeah, thank you, Dr. Akshita. Over to judges.
Akshita?
Yes, sir.
How you measured the length of incisions in straight and curved incisions, frown incision?
Hello, Dr. Akshita, are you there?
I think Akshita, you can stop your video and try to talk. It might be eating some of your pixelates. Please stop your video and try to answer.
I think she has stopped the sharing of the screen.
No, her video is on maybe and her internet is poor. Anyways,
Okay.
can you move ahead, and if she joins back through her internet
Okay.
connection, we can
Okay,
resume
okay.
the session.
Okay.
Okay.
Yeah. So our next participant is Dr. Pranjali Shirsagar, and she's going to present clinical pathological analysis of lacrimal gland lesion. Dr. Pranjali, are you ready?
Yes, sir.
Yeah,
Please
please
share
start
your screen.
sharing your screen. Yeah, good.
Is my screen visible?
Yes, yes, and you're audible also. Please start.
Good afternoon, everyone. Lacrimal gland lesions. Lacrimal lesions include a wide spectrum of the lesions which are infective, inflammatory, and neoplastic in nature. Infective lesions can be due to bacteria, virus, or parasitic. Inflammatory lesions can be non-specific or specific associated with systemic disorders like sarcoidosis, whereas neoplastic lesion can be either epithelial or non-epithelial in origin. Pleomorphic adenoma is most common benign epithelial tumor, whereas adenoid cystic carcinoma is most common malignant epithelial tumor. 50% of these lacrimal gland masses attributed to the inflammatory etiology, followed by lymphoid and neoplastic in etiology. Purpose of our study was to evaluate the clinical features, radiological and histopathological characteristics of lacrimal gland lesions of patients encountered in our hospital. Our study design was retrospective interventional case series, which included 10 patients. Coming to demographic features noted in our study, age distribution to 60 years with a mean age of 33.5 years. In our study, we noted female preponderance with male to female ratio of 0.4:1. Thorough ophthalmic evaluation of each patient was performed, and we noted the certain findings. Most common symptom noted in our patient was unilateral eyelid swelling, which was almost present in all cases, followed by pain and double vision in 30% of the cases. Most common sign noted in our patient was abaxial proptosis, which was causing further inferior dystopia. Extraocular movements restriction was noted in 60% of the cases. We have also noted reduced stomach test in 40%. Then CT scan of orbit with 2 mm section was performed for all patients. It was imaging modality of choice to know the location, size, extent, and associated feature of the mass. In our study, we noted 2 cases which showed well-defined mass, 5 cases showed fairly defined mass, and the bony changes were noted in 2 cases. All patients underwent orbitotomy. The patient with well-defined mass undergone eyelid crease incision, whereas the rest of the cases were undergone subbrow incision. Incisional biopsy was done in 5 cases. Debulking was required in 2 cases, and complete excision of mass was done in 3 cases. Well-defined lesions were completely excised with careful dissection. Ill-defined and infiltrative appearing lesions underwent multi-layer biopsy with or without debulking with the help of cryoprobe. So, these lesions underwent histopathological evaluation because of its specific characteristics, which guided us to finalize our diagnosis. Histopathological evaluation helped in our diagnosis. So, cases were diagnosed as inflammatory, which were 3 in etiology. Lymphoproliferative disorders were noted to be of 3 cases, and rest were malignant and benign tumors. Depending upon etiology, all the patients underwent treatment modality, which was differed depending upon their etiology. Local treatment as well as systemic treatment, whenever required, was planned for these patients. These are certain images which shows pre-treatment and post-treatment images. Radiological characteristics as well as pre and post-treatment images are shared. This is my concise result format, which includes age, sex, certain clinical features, as well as histopathological and radiological characteristics. Coming to discussion, as we have previously discussed, lacrimal gland lesions etiology is inflammatory more common, followed by lymphoma, followed by epithelial neoplasms. Primary malignant neoplasm of the lacrimal gland have high morbidity and mortality. Therefore, it requires a prompt diagnosis with local as well as systemic treatment. This is compiled salient features with clinical and radiological features of each lesion. This table will illustrate that the knowledge of each lesion is important to come to a diagnosis. So, coming to a reference point, as we have compared our results with a survey of 645 biopsy, which showed 11% of all vital lesions, more than 50% cases were chronic duodenitis, that is inflammatory etiology. Rest of that is 19% of the cases were pleomorphic etiology. So our results were in coordinates and collaborative with the other research articles too. To conclude, we would like to emphasize that with close clinical presentation and radiological appearances, it is important that histopathology and immunohistochemistry markers, whenever needed, are gold standard for the diagnosis. A low threshold for biopsy in such cases, yes, sir. A low threshold for biopsy will help to treat and prognosticate the better outcome in these patients. Thank you, sir.
Okay. It was a nice presentation. Over to judges.
Yes. Pranjali, it was a nice presentation. Only thing is that your cases were only 10. So it is in during your last slide, you compared with a paper where the cases were almost 650.
Yes,
so
sir.
it is very difficult to compare your findings with such a large studies. So from you can present this just as a case series, not as a research paper where you can compare with some such big studies. Otherwise, your study and work was good.
Thank you, sir.
Pranjali, what was the cause of inflammatory adenitis in your
Inflammatory
cases?
Ma'am,
Adenitis.
was more commonly noted in the pediatric population, as our cases, they were pediatric like females, and more common etiology in one case was viral etiology. Post-viral infection, she got increase in that gland size, and one was having a previous tuberculosis infection. Past history of tuberculosis noted in that patient.
Second thing, you have given importance to color vision. So is it important?
Yes, ma'am.
If yes,
Because
then
of
how?
affection of the optic nerve, because the mass is have tendency to invade intracorneal as well as extracorneal contents. So further, we will assess the vision, color vision, as well as the fundus examination is important.
Okay, thank you.
Okay.
Thank you, ma'am.
So our next speaker is Dr. Diksha Thorat, and she is going to present comparative study of anti-VEGF and triamcinolone on visual outcome following the management of central retinal vein occlusion. Over to Dr. Diksha, please.
Yes. Is my screen visible and am I audible?
Yes.
Okay.
Please start.
A very good afternoon to one and all. My name is Dr. Diksha Thorat, and today I'm going to be talking on comparative study on effect of anti-VEGF and triamcinolone on visual outcome of CRVO. I'd like to express my gratitude towards my institute Drashti Netralaya Dahod and my mentors Dr. Shreya Shah and Dr. Mehul Shah. So, to begin with, a retinal vein occlusion is the second most common cause of visual impairments after diabetic retinopathy. The most common cause of visual impairments in patients with chronic central retinal vein occlusion is macular edema. New modalities have been explored in the treatment of macular edema secondary to CRVO, among which both intravitreal triamcinolone and intravitreal anti-VEGF have shown a marked reduction in macular edema. But anti-VEGF treatments are relatively expensive, which puts an economic burden on the patients. The cost of anti-VEGF agents, which is increasing yearly, has reached a booming 8% of the medical expenses in ophthalmology, with the mean number of injections per patient be 3 times a year. Both drugs differ in the spectrum of side effects and potentially in the magnitude and direction of their effect. Therefore, the aim of our study was comparing effects of intravitreal anti-VEGF versus triamcinolone on visual outcome following management of CRVO.
The methodology included a 3-step procedure. The first step was a thorough ophthalmological examination where visual acuity was measured using Snellen's chart, intraocular pressure using Chiot's tonometer. Followed by that was a thorough anterior and posterior segment evaluation. Posterior segment was evaluated by the same surgeon using an indirect ophthalmoscope and a 20 diopter lens. The second stage was evaluation of central macular thickness by OCT Carl Zeiss model 3000, and the third step was giving intravitreal injections. This retrospective comparative study included 100 eyes with CRVO, which consecutively underwent intravitreal injection of either triamcinolone 4 milligrams or bevacizumab 1.25 milligrams. Data was retrieved from EMR and analyzed with SPSS22. Descriptive and cross-tabulation method was used for analysis, where p-value of less than 0.05 was considered statistically significant. Here are the results. Total patient enrolled were 100, 46 eyes were given anti-VEGF, 54 eyes were given triamcinolone. Mean age at presentation was 55.9 years, plus or minus 14 years. Mean central macular thickness at presentation was 353.59, plus or minus 78.89. The age distribution showed 2 peaks, one between the age group of 41 to 50 years, and the second between 61 to 70 years. This graphical representation highlights the visual acuity of patient at presentation, where the acuity of less than 6/60 is found in 48.2% of the total enrolled eyes. This visual acuity at after treatment by anti-VEGF and triamcinolone showed that there is no statistical difference in visual acuity between the two groups after intervention. The red graph highlights the anti-VEGF and blue highlights triamcinolone, where the p-value was equal to 0.26. Now, triamcinolone has been shown to have anti-inflammatory properties, anti-permeability function, and neuroprotective effects, in addition to inhibiting the expression of vascular endothelial growth factor. Several studies involving a reduction of macular edema due to CRVO with triamcinolone or anti-VEGF have been promising. In our study, there was no statistical difference in visual acuity between the two groups. But the overall results suggest that both anti-VEGF and triamcinolone are associated with the resolution of macular edema by evidence of improvement in visual acuity and CMT. The major side effect of intravitreal triamcinolone are raised IOP. In our study, 6 out of 54 eyes in intravitreal triamcinolone group showed IOP more than 21 millimeters of mercury, whereas no eyes in anti-VEGF group showed any rise. Similar results have been obtained in a study conducted by Lim et al. So therefore, to conclude, visual outcomes in both the groups were similar, but it was not statistically significant. Further investigations are warranted to explore the impact of these interventions on visual outcomes. Both intravitreal injections of VEGF and triamcinolone have shown to decrease macular edema. Intravitreal triamcinolone is economically a more viable option. Hence, after careful consideration of risks of secondary glaucoma and recurrences of macular edema, therapeutic strategy of switching to triamcinolone is still a viable option as long as the clinicians and the patients are willing to accept the potential risk. Thank you for your patient listening.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Diksha. Over to judges.
Dr. Diksha,
Yes, sir.
you said during your methods that you tested intraocular pressure by using Chiot's tonometer. Why was so?
Actually, ours is a rural-based setup where we experience a large population in terms of cataract and otherwise. So the regular practice is using Chiot's tonometer. We also have a pneumotonometer, but this had measurements using Chiot's tonometer.
I have one question for you.
Okay.
You have studied a very large series of 100 CRVOs. What was the duration of your study?
So the duration was 5 years.
Over the 5 years?
Yes, sir. It was conducted between 2015 to 2020.
Okay. Still 100 is a big number for you. Right. Okay.
Okay. So our next speaker is the last speaker rather. It's Dr. Salaka Shirsagar, and she's going to present telescreening for retinopathy of prematurity using NeoFocus imaging system, a multi-center study. Over to Dr. Salaka, please. Salaka, unmute your mic, please.
Good afternoon, respected judges and fellow colleagues. At the outset, I would like to thank BOA for this opportunity. The title of my paper is Telescreening for Retinopathy of Prematurity using NeoFocus Imaging System, a multi-center study. ROP is one of the leading causes of blindness in India. With 3.5 million preterm babies born every year, 1 lakh babies are at a risk of ROP requiring screening. With less than 100 ROP specialists all over India, this is a huge patient-doctor gap. Telescreening has hence emerged as an avenue to bridge this gap. It can either be done using smartphone imaging system or NeoFocus imaging system or RETCam. Advantages of this include shorter examination time, electronic medical images being available for documentation, comparison, medico-legal purposes, and for training of personnel. Cost effectiveness and accessibility of telescreening has been expressed in various studies. Also, this is less stressful to infants because of non-use of the practice during telescreening. One such imaging system is a Forest imaging system, which is a cheaper alternative to RETCam and is an indigenous product. It is a mydriatic retinal imaging system with 120-degree field of view and inbuilt LED light source with one-handed handling possible due to the liquid lens system. The primary outcome of our study was to study the impact and outcomes of ROP telescreening done using Forest in 2 NICUs. The study design was observational, hospital-based, and clinical. It involved 2 peripheral NICUs, which were 21 bedded and 30 bedded. Understanding was reached between the respective departments. The responsibility of identifying infants requiring screening according to NNF and RSBK guidelines was done by the neonatologist. Screening was to be done on specific days of the week, with treatment being offered in peripheral centers. 2 trained personnel then clicked pictures and uploaded these pictures to the base center. At the base center, these were analyzed by the pediatric ophthalmologist, and the reports were then mailed to the peripheral NICUs in real time. If there was any doubt regarding reporting or imaging, the patient was called to the base center for confirmation with ophthalmological examination. Patients who did not come for follow-up were called up 2 to 3 times. If they did not respond even after the phone calls, they were said to have lost to follow-up. The results involved that 94 patients were screened, with 72 from Center A and 22 from Center B. Then the prevalence rate of our babies having found to have ROP was 23.4%, with babies requiring treatment to be 7.4% of the total population. There were 11 babies who were lost to follow-up. Mean gestational age of the cohort was 32 weeks, 4 days. Mean birth weight was 1544 grams. Other conditions were diagnosed, such as fungal balls and vitreous hemorrhages, which could have been sight-threatening. There were 2 cases of recurrence, amongst which one resolved spontaneously and the other required repeat laser. This is a montage view of the picture, staged ROP as seen with Forest camera. This is a picture of AP ROP with severe plus disease. Fungal balls is seen on fundus imaging, and severe vitreous hemorrhage precluding view of the posterior pole and requiring surgery. In discussion, in our study, the sensitivity and specificity of this telescreening was found to be 100% and 98.9%, which was in accordance with various other studies done, such as KID ROP, SUN ROP, Focus ROP, and a study done by Vinikar et al. For telescreening using Forest cameras. There were other conditions other than ROP which were diagnosed, thus uncovering the potential of telescreening in not only ROP but overall ophthalmology. This was in accordance with the ROPE SOS study done by Arvind Eye Hospital, where 10 cataracts were diagnosed amongst the 8117 babies screened. The number of patients who were prevented from blindness in our study were 9 babies, which was 9.5% of the total screened population. There was of note was a patient who had fungal balls in her eyes, and she received liposomal amphotericin B for the same, which proved to be life-saving. In our study, the screening was done purely on imaging basis, without having confirmation by ophthalmoscopy for every case. Also, discharge from follow-up was done only on the basis of screening using imaging. There are studies like Photo ROP that report that the accuracy of imaging is dependent on the quality of images. Hence, telescreening using imaging is highly unlikely to completely replace ophthalmoscopic examination, but it can provide necessary primary care and diagnostic ability to peripheral areas. There was one false positive case which makes us understand that the difference between stage 2, stage 3 or regressing stage 2 is difficult to detect on telescreening using imaging. As this falls in the spectrum of treatable ROP, we must treat carefully in such patients. The peripheral retina was also found to be a little difficult to visualize and obtain clear images of. Hence, we took more effort to image and report patients who had pathology in the peripheral area, namely zone 3. There were certain artifacts such as reflections and haziness of media seen in patients having improperly dilated pupils. This could be prophesied to cause problems in patients having plus disease where pupil is improperly dilating.
1 minute left.
Logistical problems such as internet failure were also seen, which led to difficulties in sending images and receiving reports. During the duration of April 20 to November 2020, these peripheral centers were converted to COVID care centers, leading to suspension of ROP screening programs. This led us to believe that a neonatologist-led approach to ROP screening would be a better approach, as beautifully described by Gilbert et al. In their study and described in this flowchart. The advantages of this would be that management decisions would be taken immediately, no need for internet or any connectivity, and with decreased ophthalmologist visits, we could increase the coverage area. For this, what we need to do is train non-ophthalmic personnel extensively and undergo, yes, sir, just 2 minutes, and evaluate them thoroughly, and to consider the medico-legal aspects of such screening. So in conclusion, I would like to say telescreening is an effective procedure to provide timely ROP expertise, and its use beyond the scope of ROP screening is a powerful way of combating childhood blindness morbidity. Thank you so much, and I hope everybody is safe. Together we can beat COVID as well as ROP.
Thank you, Dr. Shalaka. Over to judges, please.
So who were taking the pictures in an ICU?
Ma'am, there were 2 trained personnel. They had undergone a training in Bangalore at the Forest Center for 8 days to learn how to take retinal images.
Okay. And what is the cost of the system?
Ma'am, around 5 lakhs. But it is much cheaper than the RedCam, which is around 15 lakhs now.
So what are the chances of missing the findings?
Ma'am, actually, it mainly depends on the image quality and in the peripheral retina. There was no patient whose diagnosis was missed, ma'am. But there was one patient who we thought has stage, and we followed her up on ophthalmological examination. But she was found to have regressing ROP, which did not require treatment. So maybe the chances of over-diagnosis are rather more than us missing cases.
Okay, thank you. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you.
So all the participants have finished their presentations.
Just a minute, one small announcement, Jain sir. With,
yeah, please.
Permission from all the judges, ma'am, what happened? One of the participant, Dr. Shirsagar, you can stop sharing your screen. Dr. Shalak.
Okay,
So what happened? One Dr. Preeti, she was in the first session, but she could not present because of some technical glitch. So we had given her option to present in another session. So if the judges permit, can she present in this session, ma'am?
Okay.
Yes,
Dr. Preeti,
definitely.
please share your screen.
No problem.
No problem.
Dr. Lahana sir has joined here.
Yes. I have joined because the Karandikar sir has joined. He is my guru. Then Sasra Buddha sir, then everybody here, just to meet them, I have joined, and all the presenters. So I wish them best of luck.
Good afternoon, sir.
Good afternoon, sir.
Yes. Shashi Prabhu madam, everybody.
Thank you,
You
sir.
are conducting very nicely, asking very good questions. I was just listening all the things what you were asking to the student. Very good. And Karandikar sir has joined. He is my teacher who taught me. And if whatever I am today, it is because of him. I am knowing, if I am doing something, that is Karandikar sir. If I am not doing something, that is Karandikar sir.
Tatya, let me compliment you. Afternoon's meeting with Chief Minister was very, very good.
Thank you, sir.
Okay.
Thank you very much, sir.
Yeah.
Thank
Yeah.
you.
Now
Sir,
let's
it is
hand
just
over the
because
thing
of
to Sumit.
because
Yes,
of,
Sumit,
because
go
you
ahead.
are my guru.
Arey, you are now equally guru of so many of us.
No, no, sir. No, no. You are my guru, and secondly, I love you as a guru.
Thank you so much for all good words.
Thank you,
Sir,
sir. Thank you.
Karandikar sir, you were used to come to Solapur as an examiner, sir. I was lecturer and student at that time.
See, I used to go to so many places,
Right.
places. Thank you for recollecting those memories.
Yes, sir.
Karandikar sir, good afternoon.
Good
Sir,
afternoon.
nice to see you, sir.
नागपूर कॉन्फरन्स नंतर पहिल्यांदाच भेटतोय सर.
अरे इथे आता आम्ही गरमीत होरपळून निघून राहिलो यार.
Karandikar sir, good evening. Lana sir, good evening.
निलेश, गुड इव्हिनिंग. चलो भाई, चलो आगे चलो.
गुड इव्हिनिंग निलेश, छान केलं, छान. चालू ठेव, शेवटचं घे.
Yes, sir. Thank you, sir. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, sir.
Okay, so over to Dr. Preeti. She will going to present Descemet stripping endothelial keratoplasty. It's a safety and outcomes. Over to Dr. Preeti, please.
Good afternoon, sir. Now I'm presenting about Descemet stripping endothelial keratoplasty, its safety and outcomes. I don't have any financial interest. Corneal decompensation. Secondary to endothelial dysfunction, these patients undergo DSEC, and penetrating keratoplasty is alternative to DSEC, and PK has high success rate in terms of percentage of clear corneas. But the limitations are the visual rehabilitation is slow and unpredicted high amounts of cylindrical refractive error due to sutures. And to overcome this, new procedure selectively transplanting posterior cornea containing unhealthy endothelium with healthy graft have been developed. The types of posterior lamellar keratoplasty are DSEC, automated endothelial keratoplasty, and DMEC. And corneal anatomy, epithelium, Bowman's membrane, stroma, and newly identified Duas membrane, Duas layer, Descemet's membrane, and endothelium. Endothelial layer, at birth, there are 6,000 cells per mm square. Normal young adults have 2,400 to 3,000 cells per millimeter square. Corneal decomposition occurs when more than 75% of adult cells are lost. That is when cell count becomes less than 500 cells per mm square. Characteristics of endothelium, they do not replicate, they have considerable function reserve, they have active sodium potassium ATPase pump mechanism, and it's involved in active secretion protein synthesis, and it helps keeping cornea in dehydrated state. And they have abundant mitochondria next to photoreceptors and have high metabolic activity. Indication for DSEC in our study, it's pseudophakic and aphakic bullous keratopathy, Fuchs dystrophy, and toxic anti-segment syndrome, and with persistent corneal edema, iridocorneal endothelial syndrome, congenital hereditary endothelial dystrophy. Differentiating PK versus DSEC, PK is highly invasive and induced astigmatism is more common. And in DSEC, it's less invasive and no induced astigmatism as such. And it's an open sky PK is open sky procedure, so wound will be weaker. And in DSEC, it is a closed globe procedure under the stronger globe. And aims and objective of my study, aim is to study the outcomes of DSEC. My objectives are to determine the visual outcomes of DSEC, its complication, graft survival rate, and endothelial cell loss after DSEC. And materials and method, my study site is a tertiary care center in Hyderabad. Study population, the patients who presented endothelial failure to our hospital. Study period is 1.5 years with 6 months follow-up. Study design is a prospective observational study. Sample size, it's 40 eyes of 38 patients with endothelial failure who presented to the cornea OPD, and fulfilling the inclusion-exclusion criteria were taken into our study. Inclusion criteria, all patients with endothelial failure without any significant stromal scarring. Exclusion criteria, patients with stromal scarring, ectasias, antidystrophies, hypotonic eyes, and anti-segment abnormalities were excluded from our study. Preoperative complete ophthalmic evaluation was done, including specular microscopy and B-scan. Postoperatively, visual acuity, slit lamp examination, intraocular pressure, specular microscopy, OCT were done at 1 week, 1 month, 3 months, and 6 months period to evaluate the outcome and complications. Donor cornea stored in cortisol medium at 2 to 8 degrees Celsius, and the grafts with endothelial cell count greater than 2,300 cells were selected for DSEC. And surgical procedure, corneal scleral button is mounted in the arterial anterior chamber. Limbal incision is made with 350 micron guarded blade, and lamellar dissection is done from limbus to limbus with lamellar dissectors. Then the tissue is refined. And these 6 steps, sclerocorneal tunnel incision is made. Descemetorrhexis is done with reverse Sinskey hook. Descemet's membrane is peeled off with a Descemet stripper. Donor lenticle is inserted using sheet glide, and anterior chamber air tamponade is given. And this is a picture of aphakic bullous keratopathy, and this is a post-op picture. And results, demographic data, total eyes were 40, and male to female ratio is 18:20 patients. Age group is between 45 to 80 years. An indication of DSEC, pseudoaphakic bullous keratopathy is the most common indication in our study. Others are TAS, Fuchs, ABK, and PBK with Fuchs. Laterality, right is 51% and 45% is left, and 2 patients underwent both eyes. And pre-op BCVA, almost 21 patients had vision worse than 2/60. And post-op BCVA at 3 months post-op, 13 eyes visual acuity, 13 eyes had visual acuity better than 6/18, and 32 eyes had visual acuity better than 6/60. At 6 months, 28 patients had visual acuity better than 6/18, and 33 eyes had visual acuity better than 6/60. So PAT t-test value, P is less than 0. P value is less than 0.05 on comparing pre-op and post-op BCVA, 1 month, 3 months, 6 months BCVA. Hence, it's the improvement is statistically significant. Intraocular pressure, in our case, steroid, 7 eyes responded had steroid-induced glaucoma. So we treated those patients with anti-glaucoma medications. Endothelial cell count, mean pre-op donor endothelial cell count is 3017 cells per mm square. Mean endothelial cell count after 3 months post-op is 2322, and after 6 months is 2038 cells, and mean cell loss is 23% after 3 months and 32.4% after 6 months. So on comparing pre-op and post-op, endothelial cell loss is statistically significant. And complication noted is graft dislocation is noted in one eye, steroid-induced glaucoma in 7 eyes, pupillary block in 2 eyes, and concomitant ocular disorders affecting visual acuity were detected after surgery in 7 eyes. And in our study, the mean best-corrected visual acuity improved significantly, and posterior dislocation of the most of the complications were immediate, and late post-operative complications were minor and manageable. However, larger sample size and longer follow-up would be better to determine the safety and efficacy of this procedure. My references, and thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Preeti. And over to judges.
What was the cause of pupillary block?
And the air tamponade, air which we are inducing during the surgery caused pupillary block within 24 hours after surgery. Okay. So we did rebubbling to remove the block.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am.
So, judges, please make a note that Dr. Akshita Sharma, she has presented already, and in between she had lost the network connection. So we are left for the questions now. So you can ask the questions to her. Dr. Akshita Sharma, are you there?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. And sorry for the network issues.
The frown incision and the horizontal incision in SICS.
Yes.
Are there any questions?
I asked the question and then her network was probably lost.
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir. Sorry, sir. Yes, sir.
I asked her about how she measured the length of straight and frown incision.
So using the help of calipers, the incision was measured.
But with the help of calipers, you can measure in frown incision straight end to end. But that is not the true length of the incision.
Yes, sir. Regarding frown incision, we take it in segments. Along the curvature, we measure in parts to measure the actual length of the frown incision.
So what was the incision length of straight and curved incision in all these surgeries?
Sir, my length varied from 5.5 to 6.5 mm in both the cases.
5.5 to 6.5.
Yes, sir.
Don't you think that 60 SICS surgeries, 30 in each group, is a little less sample size for arriving to the diagnosis of this astigmatism and all that?
Yes, sir. Sir, I do agree. This was one of the limitations of my paper, having a limited sample size. But sir, this was a part of my thesis topic. And since I had to follow up the patients up till a period of 6 weeks, and with the present COVID situation, I lost follow-up. So at present, would arrange get 60 patient samples.
Yes, thank you.
Okay. So now we have finished all the papers and presentation. So I would like to thank you, judges, Dr. Prasad ma'am, Dr. Sarvadi sir, Dr. Sahasrabudhe sir, and all participants and organizing committee and Bombay Ophthalmic Association and Maharashtra Ophthalmic Society, and especially Dr. Sumit for giving this opportunity. So by this, we can conclude this session, and over to Dr. Sumit.
Yes. Thank you, Jayan sir, and thank you all the judges for giving their time and all the participants. We must say that all the residents, 80% of them are doing the COVID duty and they took out time. Many of them agreed to exchange for each other. Those had a duty on 23rd, they came on 16 people went on 23rd. There is a lot of understanding and they managed all this very well. So big thank you, and it's a proud moment to have such a participants presenting in even after doing a COVID duty.
Yeah.
Thank